Good evening. You are on the smoking section with Stephen Helfer, and I just got back from a vacation where I went to Utah to do some skiing, and I traveled there on bus between Boston and Salt Lake City, and I found it reasonably comfortable. The buses stop pretty often, and for us smokers, that's a good thing because we can get a break to smoke every, I would say probably 3 or 4 hours at the most. And it just seems that the people on the bus who smoke are the most sociable, so that all of us smokers get out and we share lights and we share cigarettes and we share conversation. And I think it makes the trip a lot more pleasant. Of course, I would prefer, as it was in the old days, where we could smoke on the bus. At all the buses in the United States, you could smoke in the back of the bus. And interestingly enough, when you did that, you never got complaints. People in the front of the bus didn't get irritated eyes, and they didn't find the air impossible to breathe. And but over the years, people become very, very sensitive to secondhand smoke, so that I think if you lit a cigarette on a bus today, people would become very they would become very agitated. But of course, we live in times when people become very agitated about all sorts of things, including tobacco. And I was smart enough to bring a lot of tobacco with me from our favorite store, of course, Levitt and Pierce in Harvard Square. So I didn't purchase any tobacco anywhere along the way. And therefore didn't get a chance to compare tobacco prices. Although the last time that happened to me, when I was in Washington, D.C., I found out that roll your own tobacco in Washington, D.C. Is taxed at the same rate as commercial cigarettes are taxed, so that I ended up spending, I think, about $12 for a package of Bugler in Washington, D.C. I don't know what the taxes are in Utah, where I was, because, as I say, I did not purchase any cigarettes there. And then returning, I came back on the train, and again, it wasn't that long ago that trains had smoking sections, and we didn't have to get off, and it was always very pleasant because the smoking sections, again, were where people were most sociable, especially if they could drink and smoke at the same time. I always remember the time that I was on the train in the middle of the night, and I kind of woke up and decided I would make my way forward to where the kind of what's called the lounge car was, which in the evening they would have as a smoking section. And I went through the entire train, several cars, and everybody was sleeping and quiet, and nothing was going on. And then I got into the lounge car, and it was bright, and there were people laughing, and they were smoking, and they were drinking, and they were young and old people. So tobacco and alcohol are very, very social, what you might call phenomena. They tend to make people much more friendly and much more sociable, and it's a shame that I think that our society is becoming more and more uptight, particularly because of the fact that fewer and fewer people are smoking. They're able to get along less and able to put aside their grievances, which, of course, tobacco is famous for. And as I've said many times on this program, the American Indian revered tobacco, and revered tobacco for many reasons, but one reason of which is that it seemed to facilitate the ability to compromise and be conciliatory and discuss matters which in many cases might be very controversial and might get people very upset with one another, but when they smoked a peace pipe, it enabled people to sit down with each other and see their differences in a much calmer way. And that is one of the reasons I think our government is now become very, very, what you might say is dysfunctional. In fact, Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, who is thinking about running for president, he said both parties seem to engage in vengeance politics. And I think if more of these people smoked, especially cigars and cigarettes, and had backroom deals, which was the way government worked in the old days, I think we would have a very, very much more functioning government. Out at Alta, Utah, where I was staying in a lodge, and as a matter of fact, at one point there was so much snow outside that we were forbidden to leave the lodge. So then, of course, I had to find a place where I could smoke in the lodge, which I did, and I met other people there, and so it was very pleasant. And even though as a smoker I feel besieged and I feel bullied and taxed and looked down upon, I still think tobacco is something that is a very, very, is a plant that's worthy of reverence, as it has been for almost 8,000 years in the New World. And although the momentum in recent years particularly has been fewer and fewer people smoking and more restrictions, I think that with a little perseverance, or with a lot of perseverance, the times will eventually change, and people will realize that this type of almost kind of fanatic anti-tobaccoism is something that we will look back in history and either laugh at. It's come and gone over the last certainly 100 years in this country. I mean, there was a time, for example, when smoking was banned in Harvard Yard and smoking was banned in Boston, in areas of Boston Common, and it disappeared. This whole anti-smoking business disappeared, and now it's come back, and it's come back with a vengeance. And unfortunately, it's come back at a time when there is a tremendous amount of surveillance. We have to deal now with smoke detectors put in buildings and smoke detectors put on trains, so that if you try to sneak a cigarette, you can be caught instantly. And we're living in a time now, of course, where there's all kinds of surveillance and all kinds of social controls. And I think that, again, I think a lot of this is reflected, this kind of easygoingness that is, I think, promoted by the use of tobacco is kind of disappearing. I mean, for example, here in Cambridge, somebody who has been, is now really under fire, under terrible fire, because at a meeting here in Cambridge where they were discussing racial epithets, instead of using the term N-word, she actually said the word to which it is used, and she is getting in trouble now. She has become labeled as a racist and having broken what are called core norms. And this kind of petty nastiness and petty looking for people to make mistakes, this is something that I think is very, very symptomatic of a society which has become so uptight and so afraid. Like, I'm afraid to say that word right now on the screen. This is very petty and not a good way to live. Now, Audrey Silk, of course, who is probably the foremost tobacco rights activist in the world, has a great Facebook page, which I go to, and it was very interesting because she had an article on the public housing, the federal public housing smoking ban, which of course was put into place by the Obama administration, or at least it was started under the Obama administration. And out of 3,300 public health agencies, there were relatively few that did have such smoking bans. But when the Obama administration first proposed the rule, and when it was finally cleared or put into place, then that affected 3,300 public housing. And one of the things that there was a very good article in a some kind of online magazine about governance, and who interviewed a lot of officials. It did not interview any smokers, but it was said, for example, that a lot of the people who are most harshly affected by this ban are the elderly. And a woman named Lakeisha James Smith, who is the Elder Services Coordinator for the Bloomington Housing Authority in Illinois, said, quote, "It's a big shift. It's a change in their environment. When you're used to a routine, change takes time." And we're talking about elderly people. Now, of course, if you smoke, it's supposed to be lethal, and you're not supposed to be elderly, but yet we seem to have a lot of people in their 70s and 80s and even 90s who have smoked for 60 and 70 years, and many of these people have mobility problems. So these people are now being pushed out into the street. And fortunately, there are people in authority who are recognizing just how draconian this is. And someone who is a man named Jim Armstrong, policy analyst for the Public Housing Authority's Directors Association, says that it is probable that evictions will start coming. Now, this is something that's happened. This went into effect, I think, in September 2018. But for example, if you think about the Arctic vortex, whereby it gets so cold that if you go out, you are in danger of suffering from suffocation due to the cold paralyzing your respiratory system. We're talking about pushing people outside and endangering their lives. Now, this is one thing that people in public health, this is something that is an absolute transgression of public health ethics, to put people in situations where their lives are in danger for their own good, to push people that far that it's endangering their lives. is a transgression of any kind of public health ethics. So this war on smoking has really turned public health into a very unethical place, as we've crossed. Now, someone named Donald Cameron, director of the Charleston Housing Authority in South Carolina, has been talking about, but as kudos to him, because he says he will never evict anybody from smoking in the Charlestown Housing Authority. But even though he says he will not do it, he worries that other people do. And he says, quote, "We're going to get to a point when somebody is going to decide to vigorously enforce this, and there will be evictions. Magistrates at the local level will then have to consider if it was serious enough lease violation. 9 out of 10 times, the case will be an elderly person." I was here in Cambridge, and I went to a meeting where they were talking about, and we're very happy, actually, about evicting an elderly woman who really couldn't go outside, and she continued to smoke in her apartment. I'm sure she tried to hide it, but they were very happy she even got a note from her doctor saying that this was going too far, and that for her well-being in general, they should not evict her, but they did evict her. Fortunately, I think she had children who came to her rescue, but this is really something that I think public health officials who are anti-smoking should really start doing some self-reflection and seeing what kind of damage they are doing in the name of health. Bloomington, well, one thing that really sounds ridiculous here is that Bloomington, Indiana, will focusing on helping residents live healthier lives and will help them replace nicotine. This fall, the Housing Authority will kick off a happiness campaign with activities based around mindfulness. You know, that sounds so patronizing and so ineffective and so like pushing people around, especially elderly people. Now, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention put out a what I would consider probably some kind of spurious study, and they say it will save states almost $150 million a year. Most of the savings would come from reduced health costs related to secondhand smoke. You know, I don't think it's ever been shown at all that any of these restrictions, or that even the reduced smoking rate, has saved a penny in terms of medical expenditures. It's interesting that all of these studies that are put out by these anti-smoking government organizations like the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention always say, we predict we will save X number of dollars. But none of the studies actually are done retrospectively, so that none of them say, well, we have saved X number of dollars, because each year, as smoking rates decline, health expenditures in this country increase. So all these savings that were projected in the last 30 years, one after another, that if we reduce smoking, we will reduce medical costs, none of these have come to any kind of fruition. There is no savings in medical expenditures. And At the time of the rules proposal, public housing stakeholders warned that it doesn't take into account the day-to-day realities of public housing directors. And a lot of the public housing directors were against this because at a time when public housing is at a crisis in terms of funding, many of the public housing is having many problems with mold and with decaying structures. Here, just because we want to make it very difficult and unpleasant for people to smoke, we put these bans in, and the public housing directors themselves, again, something that the Obama administration put forward, the public housing authority directors themselves have said, listen, this is something that we really can't have, that really is not a priority, and that will create a lot of difficulties, and it has. And I think that we will see, I hope we will see someday this overturned, especially if Audrey Silk's excellent lawsuit, she of course is the founder and director of New York City Citizens Lobbying Against Smoker Harassment. She has put together, with the help of a very good lawyer, a lawsuit which really questions the federal government's jurisdiction to impose a rule like this. This is overriding all kinds of local authorities and all kinds of state authorities. And so New York City Clash's lawsuit is something that really hits at a kind of government, a kind of very large government type of control over the lives of people and the lives of smaller jurisdictions. So I think that lawsuit has a distinct chance of either prevailing or at least bringing a lot of attention to this. I was also interested, because I've spoken about snus on this program a lot, that when I was in Alta, I did meet a Swedish man, and he was using, he was quite a skier. In fact, he goes all over the world to ski, and he's a former ship captain, or he still is a ship captain who is able to take a lot of time off. And he was using snus, and I was excited to see that he used it all the time, he said, and he used the snus that was not in the small packages. Evidently, he uses the loose snus, which he said is the hardcore way to use it, and he uses it all the time. And again, he talked about how the European Union has banned snus, I guess, in every country except for Sweden, where it's most popular, and where even public health authorities have acknowledged that it is much safer than using cigarettes. Anyway, thanks for watching the Smoking Section with Stephen Helfer, and I will see you next week. It's good to be back. Good night.